taking your line.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you to coming to our program tonight, Lost Monmouth County, presented by Randall Gabrielan. My name is Lisa Kelly. I work for the library to set up programs, and I do outreach. If you need anything tonight, please don't hesitate to ask me or find me afterwards. I just want to mention we have a full roster of programs every month. We've never really stopped. In person, virtual, and a little bit of each. This one tonight is a hybrid because we are streaming to Facebook Live. Next month we're having, for Earth Day, a special art exhibit by a group called Art for Sea. They are artists who come together to show their work and sell it to support a selection of different environmental organizations, and they're focused on the ocean this time around. So they're having an opening reception on April 7th at 6 p.m. You can meet the artists and also come and listen to a guest speaker, Tim Dillingham. He's the executive director of the American Littoral Society, and he's going to talk about ocean environmental issues. And so that will be here on the 7th at 6 p.m. And then that following week begins Library Week. We're having a special panel of authors called Waves of Mystery. Sisters in Crime authors of the Jersey Shore. So there's 5 or 6 authors coming in. There'll be a discussion, panel discussion. They primarily write mysteries. They'll do some readings and they'll do book signings. So that is on April 9th. And I have one more March program for Women's History Month on Zoom on Wednesday, March 30th, called Storytelling for Personal Empowerment. An organization called Say It Forward is leading a workshop to teach us how to control the narratives of our own personal stories, to take control and to just feel more powerful, to become empowered. And in fact, the organization Say It Forward is kind of behind the conference that generated these photos on the wall. So that's on Zoom if you'd like to register. There are flyers over there on the table. So now I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Randall Gabrielan. He is an author. He's written many books about many of the, if not all, of the towns in Monmouth County. He's also the New Jersey historian for many years. He's done that, and many other history-related things.
Many other history-related.
Share a
Like
smattering.
Cottage, I might add.
Yes, so thank you for coming, Randy, and let's welcome him tonight.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for coming out. It's great to be in front of a live audience again, my first in over 2 years. And even if the pandemic is not over, perhaps we can have a semblance of normality by gathering together. I'm glad to have a new book to talk about. It's Lost Monmouth County, released a few months ago. And what it is, a tour of the changing landscape. Now, there are an enormous number of places that are no longer around, so I had to be selective. I cover representations from every part of the county, and there's a special focus on Long Branch. I suppose that's good and bad. It should stimulate interest here, but on the other hand, it reflects that Long Branch has lost so much. Indeed, one could have written a separate book on Long Branch alone. My format is going to be to show pictures. I hope I can get through all 24 of them, introduce each one, give a narration on some, and readings from the book on most. As the opening slide indicates, the purpose is to determine clarity. And what I mean by that, there is so much myth, mythology, mistaken information about certain places. So on a few of them, I try to clear that up. Portray nostalgia. Everyone seems to have some aspect of past life that they wish were still around or they remember fondly from our youth. I do too. And depict lifestyle change. Some of the things that used to be, some of the activities, some of the businesses that used to be commonplace in the area are so long gone, we've forgotten about them. And finally, at the end, to celebrate preservation, because not every change is totally gone. Sometimes they are transformed in a manner where their original purpose is lost and forgotten. So in that way, in showing places that are around in a different format, we can appreciate change for the positive in many instances. So let's go to the first slide. I think, oh, you don't have to recognize that because the title indicates it's the reservation on the oceanfront in Long Branch. As many of you know, this was a housing colony built by Nate Salisbury, the entertainer, the showman, and one of the most prominent people ever to have called Long Branch his summer home. Now, a couple things about the reservation. Salisbury didn't live there. Buffalo Bill didn't live there. I don't know if we'll ever get past that rumor, but let me tell you some things about the reservation and Nate Salisbury. He was born in 1846 in Rockport, Illinois. He served in the Civil War. In fact, he was almost taken for dead once. He was an actor and a showman on stage in his own right. But what gave him his career highlight was Salisbury meeting William F. Cody in the early 1880s, an encounter that led to the major work of the Salisbury career, the promotion management of the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. While Cody was responsible for the vaudeville stage recreations and reminiscences of his exploits in the unsettled West, management by Salisbury made the show an international success. Numerous European venues included the Vatican and Windsor Council. Salisbury's long and often contentious relationship with Cody became breached in the 1890s with litigation that extended beyond Salisbury's death. Salisbury produced one more exotic show, Black America, spectacular in his time, racist in ours. The Times headline of May 25, 1895, opening tells more than one can embrace now. Wild Negro chants and dances in Black America, Brooklyn, may be seen the fun-loving darky of old slavery days. Ironically, the show opened at Ambrose Park, South Brooklyn, where, during the prior year, the Wild West show had been performed. The show was later mounted at Madison Square Garden. Now, what exactly was the reservation and where was it? Frank Beater, his manager, attracted him to the shore where the pair had adjoining houses that were located at 321 and 323 Liberty Street. Neither is extant, and no image is known to have survived. Property records demonstrate that Salisbury did not own 311 Liberty Street, despite persistent claims that he did. This is one of the great myths of contemporary Long Branch. The appeal of Long Branch inspired Salisbury to plan a magnificent waterfront housing colony as retirement approached. He bought in 1900 a 16 2/3 acre tract in North Long Branch, where the East End Hotel formerly stood, land that possessed a long, even notorious history. Alexander Cristollar had erected a building in 1862, initially called the Atlantic Hotel, and later the Arlington House. But the East End, after damage in an 1880 storm, was razed the next year. The vacant land was later owned by John Hoey, who failed to build a planned hotel, and by Jay Gould, among the evil of 19th century crooks, one who is inexplicably celebrated by some local historians as a famous Long Branch visitor. The plot was laid out in 14 lots along Ocean Avenue that were bisected by a private street called The Trail. Plans were made to construct 11 houses, but only 9 were built. Salisbury named his development the reservation during a time when most indigenous residents in the decreasingly Wild West were herded into reservations. Salisbury's choice of Native American names reflected his respect for the Indians. Unfortunately, Salisbury died not long thereafter. Christmas Eve 1902, his widow kept the property for a number of years, eventually sold off the houses, and they fell one by one to the elements and other causes. One survives, and I think most of you know it's now the headquarters of the county park.
Oh, that's where it is.
7 presidents.
So it's 7 presidents.
Let's take a look at the Franklin Cottage and the Elberon Hotel. Now, the Franklin Cottage is widely known for one thing. That's where President Garfield died. But so little is known about Franklin, or just what the surroundings were there. Franklin was born in 1844 near Newcastle, England, a son of Colonel Gilbert and Jane Cunard Franklin. His mother was a daughter of Samuel Cunard, the founder of the steamship line. Franklin, employed by Cunard at age 16 in Halifax, Canada, became the firm's agent in New York in 1875, following the death of his father-in-law. His tenure with Cunard firm may have been brief, as Franklin was involved with industry later in the decade. The relationship became strained over later debt issues. Franklin bought 3 lots in 1872 from Theodore Thomas. The lots were located on the Lewis B. Brown tract, he's the namesake of Elberon, at the northeast corner of Ocean and Lincoln Avenues. Franklin hired Charles McKim to design his residence, built in 1876. Now, what about the hotel? This is a picture owned by the library, and what I find fascinating is that it shows a great view of the 2 buildings in the same image. The hotel, rather than having been purpose-built as a hotel, was put together by the combining of 2 cottages, perhaps accomplished by Franklin at the behest of Brown. The hotel, after it opened for the 1878 season, became the most exclusive and costliest in Long Branch. Its appeal stemmed in large part from its location in Elberon, the southern district of Long Branch, a locale some distance from the hotel district. The only other hotel in its class, the Hollywood Hotel, was in nearby West End on a tract west of the shore. You could say that the 2 most prestigious hotels in Long Branch were so popular and costly because they were the non-Long Branch shore. So the story of Garfield being shot in Washington and brought to Long Branch, ostensibly to recover because of the salubrious oceanfront air, is well known. So let's take a look at what happened here. The hotel became enmeshed in financial difficulties. He was unable to pay his substantial loans, so the mortgages were foreclosed and the hotel was sold at a sheriff's sale. The Franklin property was...
For how much?
Excuse me?
At the shower sale at that point, how much do you think it was sold for?
I don't know.
What is it now? Sorry.
Let's see.
Sorry
One
to
mortgagee, his cousin, Sir Bache Cunard, had Franklin arrested in 1887. The Franklin property was sold 2 years later and subsequently had multiple owners prior to its destruction by fire on November 22nd, 1914. The Franklin Cottage was extensively damaged by fire in 1919, with its remains raised in 1920. Now, Franklin and Garfield were so well associated with one another, and Garfield's dying there, that when the 2 of them died, Franklin in 1929 and his wife Susan 3 years later, the obituaries of both, this is almost a half century, or was a half century later, mentioned that Garfield died at their home.
What is it now?
They're gone.
What was built there?
Well, there's a private house on a little street where the Franklin Cottage
What
was.
street goes down
In
there?
fact, I believe I mentioned it here, 7 Garfield Road.
Garfield area.
These two images are well known to Long Branch historians. Unfortunately, the one on the left is little known for the person who built it, but is better known for the person who destroyed it. They're both interesting stories. They're father and son, Cornelius Kingsland Garrison and William R. Both of them built distinguished Elberon mansions, each of which was probably the most costliest in Long Branch in its time.
What time?
Let's see, Cornelius was born in 1809 at Fort Montgomery, New York, near West Point. He was engaged in maritime work, went to the California gold rush, and made a fair amount of money out west. He was called a Commodore, but the rank was more or less an honorific. He bought this property in Elberon in 1880 for $30,000. That was a lot of money back there. And he built this place, which was called a marine villa. The 3-story house, no doubt the costliest in Long Branch to date, was called the Marine Villa for its proximity to the water or for the 70-foot tower on its south end that contained an observatory at its peak. It has 35 rooms, finished in ash, mahogany, and California redwood, included a smoking room and another for billiards, the latter measuring 35 by 25 feet. The architect is unknown, but the owner may have been the inspiration for its minarets and Moorish towers. As Kingsland studied architecture, and he may have been enamored by the Moorish revival style that enjoyed a brief spell of interest in the post-Civil War years, but was rarely employed in residential construction. Evidence is offered by the Moorish-influenced tower built in his monument at his gravesite at Greenwood Cemetery, Brooklyn. It's not on the screen, but the gravesite is in the book. By the way, President Grant said the house may have been called, or could have been called, the House of Many Gables. As you can see, it was quite an architectural excess. I have a feeling whoever designed it had a plan book and he wanted to include one of every motif in the house. Now, his son, William.
Where is that house? Where was it located?
Where was it? It was in southern Elberon. I think it was near Lincoln Avenue, and I don't recall if I put the address in here. Now, William, born in 1834 in Canada, where his family may have been visiting, also had transportation interests and made a good deal of money, which enabled him to build the house on the right. This is one of the saddest stories I know in residential history. A few days after Garrison occupied Castlewall, he died from injuries suffered in the June 29, 1882 wreck of a Pennsylvania Railroad train on the Parkers Creek Bridge that links Shrewsbury and Oceanport. This is the bridge where President Grant famously aided in the rescue efforts. The Garrison estate sold a furnished castle wall to the Reverend Charles P. Hoffman in 1888, and he apparently built the castle wall tower that year. The castle wall burned in 1938, had another fire the next year, and that prompted removal by the city of Long Branch. Where was it? Castlewall Avenue is in the environs right now. Here's one from my hometown, Middletown. On the screen, I call it the Seabrook Wilson House. Its proper name in the book, I call it the so-called Spy House. I see some nods there because it gained enormous popularity and a following in its so-called Spy House incarnation. Now, I hesitate to repeat legend and rumor because what it does often is just reinforce it. But I had to put in print a lot of the things I've been saying over the years. How did it get to be the Spy House? Well, it had been the White House Tavern for a number of years. Also, there were many bedrooms on the second floor, and I heard that a youngster on a school trip inquired, what were all those bedrooms used for? Well, you can imagine in those days. But when the Township of Middletown acquired it, they thought they were going to restore it. There was a historical society formed for the purpose, and they needed a snazzier name than White House, although they did call it the White House for a number of years. So they made up this spying legend out of folklore. It sounded great. Of course, it was right on the water. You can't see very much. Oh, you can see New York there, but gee, if you want to overlook activity on the water, go up on a hill. And eventually the curator admitted, oh yeah, the spying was done from Garrett's Hill. But what was it as a spy house? Well, it turned into what effectively was an attic for the Bay Shore. It had all sorts of accumulated objects, lots of stuff. People loved it. It was a money funnel. They tried to restore it, but a lot of the changes were not sympathetic, did as much harm as good. And in her constant need to raise funds, the curator, Gertrude Neidlinger, who I have to admit did more to save the place than anyone else, got involved with someone that I believe is a charlatan for ghost tours. And the financial irregularities were considerable. And the upshot is Neidlinger was removed, the Spy House days were terminated, the museum operation was terminated, the contents were scattered. She wasn't very good on records, so they returned the artifacts to those they knew who had them, and the remainder were sent to another museum. And eventually the property was traded to the county of Monmouth, which spent an enormous amount of money restoring the place properly. And now it's a park headquarters for Bayshore Waterfront Park. And you can see it on the Weekend in Old Monmouth tour. Now, I have to admit that people will identify it as the Spy House as long as there are former kids around who took the tour. Yeah, my kids too. But if you want the real history, here it is on page 135 of the book.
Come on, we don't want to know. It's a Spy House. Oh, I saw a lot of good movies there.
Let's see, in this crowd, I think everyone is old enough to have been to a drive-in movie.
Yeah.
And when I included drive-in movies, I thought, oh, everyone has some nostalgic memories of that. But then when you think that the last one closed 30 years ago, there are a lot of people that never saw one. But still, they were enormously popular in their time. And this isn't the only entertainment type entry in the book. And I put it in here because the drive-ins resonate more than the others, which include movie houses in Red Bank. There were so many of them, and quite a few in Long Branch as well. Most of them did not last very long. There was something called the Main Street opera house, which wasn't really for performance of that kind of musical performance, opera, but an all-purpose entertainment center. And they didn't last very long, but a few of them are described here. So places of entertainment have tended to come and go, sometimes repurposed, often destroyed. When you think of what's going on now, look at the number of movie houses, which probably hit their peak around 1950 when they changed at least 2 times a week. But then they started reducing the number of screens because you needed larger ones for the new type movies. And look what's happening now. They're suffering at the gate because, well, the pandemic, but people find it's easier to watch a film at home. And Lisa, maybe we have a bigger audience at home too. One can get very comfortable. Well, the book tells the story, including the first one that opened in 1933 in Camden, and the last one that closed in Hazlitt in 1991. And usually the land became too valuable for a drive-in. But when they tended to open, there were accessible highways, open plots of ground, and for the time, it was a good use of the land.
You know why they were popular, though, right?
Excuse me?
You know why drive-ins were popular, right?
Oh, yeah, well, there is the legitimate reason and I suppose the illegitimate reason. But the best thing is, if you had kids, you didn't need a babysitter. Stick them in the back seat. And as I experienced drive-ins as a parent, but as I point out, there are some that knew it both ways. They went as children, and they took their own children. Cowboy City. Now, this was a genre of highway entertainment that probably was intentionally short-lived. They were popular in the 50s and 60s. I say they, there are multiples. When people in the post-World War II years were getting out, they were exploring the countryside, land was plentiful, and these places were built to attract those passers by. Now, let's see what Cowboy City was about. Mythology characterized the telling of the settlement of the Old West from the earliest writings to recent entertainment. Stereotypes that are colored at best and distorted at worst claim a hollow nobility of the cause, distorted claim savagery of the Native Americans, and depict unjustified heroism of the cowboys along with their whiteness. While scholarship of the past several decades has brought historical accountability to the period, the myths and legends will endure as long as memories linger over mid-20th century television shows, children's toy, capgun six-shooters, and visits to recreational sites such as Cowboy City. Now, the theme park presented exciting live action in which one could be a cowboy for a day, join a posse, capture the Dalton gang, lock up the outlaws, and ride the stagecoach as well as the old Copper Creek Railroad. The genuine verisimilitude had one girl recalling 6 days later that she was so frightened during a stagecoach holdup that on seeing the gun she cried out, "Don't shoot!" A second girl made believe she was Annie Oakley and dressed as a cowgirl when visiting. Another kid remembered that having gotten into some unspecified trouble on the coach, he was thrown off and had to walk back. Now, this was a difficult one to keep going because it was seasonal. They had animals. Sometimes they sold them off and then, of course, would have to get new ones the next year. So this lasted only about 10 years. And This land was vacant for quite some while until they built an age-limited housing development there called Equestria. It was on Highway 33 near the Colts Neck border. Now, here is a second one. This one lasted a little longer. It opened in 1955. It was such an attraction that the governor visited the place. And at Storyland Village, we know that nostalgia of childhood fairy tales endures in the voices of caregivers, the vividness of the printed page, and memories in the mind. Fortunate children were enlivened by visiting Storyland Village, a child's garden of verses and stories, where gigantic characters dotted an amusement park. At Storyland Village, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, but he did not fall. Well, he didn't until the entire park fell. It was built in 1955 on 54 acres at the Asbury Park Circle. And there, the young visitors to Storyland reveled in the presence of literary friends. Red Riding Hood was there, along with Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Peter the Pumpkin Eater, and Jack the Giant Killer. Also present were Mistress Mary, quite contrary, who watched over her garden, Little Miss Muffet, who ate her curds and whey, accompanied by a spider eager to get beside her, and Little Bo Peep, who lost her sheep. The animals here were contained in fences, and they included the 3 little pigs present along with their respective houses. The fences, which held back the dish that ran away with the spoon from Hey Diddle Diddle, were not impenetrable and did not prevent a few notable escapes. It closed in 1962. In 1964, a Sears store was built there. I mean, these places were temporary, waiting for the highest and best use of the land. And Sears, of course, was quite a retail powerhouse then, but now Sears, like Storyland Village, has fallen.
Is that the Sears that's part of Seaview Square?
No, it was across the street from Seaview Square.
Oh, it was originally somewhere else?
Right across the street, right on the circle.
Oh, okay.
There's something there now. I
If
don't.
you look up, there's still something there.
Yeah, there is something there. It's hard to imagine a zoo on a local highway. But Holton and his family bought 200 acres of Twin Brook Farm in 1919. He was a trader in exotic birds and had good overseas contacts, and he thought that with his contacts he could get some more animals and open a zoo on the highway, which is exactly what he did.
35 or 36?
35.
Twin Brook. Where would that be on 35?
This would be where the Coles and the Stop and Shop are.
Ah.
Right across the street from the
Food
clown
Town,
sign.
yeah.
So it was an immediate success. Highway travel was just getting started in the 1920s. But unfortunately, there were a couple of incidents there. As I just mentioned, some animals would escape from Storyland Village. Well, that happened at the zoo as well. On August 2nd, 1926, a full-grown male spotted leopard broke out of its shipping cage while workers were preparing a permanent enclosure and disappeared into the countryside. The immediate alert spread panic, first throughout the town and then over an increasingly wider area. The armed residents who hunted the beast raised panic themselves, as other residents feared the hunters more than the hunted. Holton, who exhibited a stuffed leopard, as many did not know then what one looked like, offered a $100 reward for his capture, dead or alive. Taking a deadly wild animal alive hardly seemed an appealing option. False sightings and efforts to attract and trap the beast continued for 2 months. New York newspapers reported the escape, although some speculated that the uproar might have been a publicity stunt. Finally, on October 15th, the leopard, caught in a trap, was killed by Willard F. Irons on his farm in Island Heights, Ocean County,
Wow.
about 45 miles from the zoo.
Wow.
Bolton identified the animal, which was believed to have traveled this distance by following a railroad line. Panic subsided into ongoing wariness over zoo safety. Now, that wasn't the last of the escapes. Tragedy struck on July 22nd, 1927, when a female Lobo wolf that had been raised in captivity and treated by some as if domesticated escaped while being transferred to another enclosure and headed for the nearby Holton residence. There, in concert with the family's German Shepherd, it attacked Tommy, the Holton's 2.5-year-old son, fatally wounding him. A frightened and enraged public wanted the place closed by compulsion if necessary. While the zoo remained open for several weeks, the public was appeased by a despairing and broken Holton, who terminated operations on October 16th, 1927. There are pirate legends all over the shore area, including the Raritan Bay shore. Oh, there's a treasure lake there, and some promoters would eagerly trade on the legend. Two of them were Morrissey and Walker, who in 1921 built a 77 by 36 foot pirate ship to use as an office. Why a ship? Well, you couldn't pass by without noticing it, and inexpensive lots, theirs were small lots in cheap land, were competitive, and they wanted to attract attention, and they certainly did.
Was this along 35?
This was along 35.
I think I have a vague memory.
Vague memory?
Yeah.
So do I.
Yeah.
You sure you want to say that? Because I'm gonna recite the dates, and I don't want to reveal your age while you're remembering it. No, actually, it wasn't that long ago, and there were multiple locations. He moved it as they changed their developments. So it was in Aberdeen and Cliffwood, and eventually the Morrissey and Walker firm closed after the death, and it was sold to Paul Cahill, and it was moved again, this time to Old Bridge Township, just over the border. And what made this nostalgic? Well, shore-bound children perceive the pirate ship as a symbol that means we are almost there, especially if the Cliffwood Beach Boardwalk and beach was the destination. I remember the place during the early 1950s. It was awful. The boardwalk was splintered, and the many rocks in the sand inspired the name Stony Beach. Hurricane Donna wiped out the boardwalk in 1916, although the pirate ship endured. And then finally it met its end at the Old Bridge location on May 13th, 1993 by fire. But that's my nostalgia of traveling from Jersey City to the shore. We're almost there.
Oh, I remember Clearwater.
Well, this is a rather nondescript swim club. In fact, it would probably have been forgotten if not for one event and one entertainer. And what happened there? Well, there were, besides the usual swim club activities of pool and sporting activities, musical events enlivened many nights. Loud music lasted long into the night, raised the ire of some nearby residents. There was a desire for a curfew. But on September 11th, 1970, the music ran past the 10 o'clock curfew. There was a large crowd there. They were enthusiastic. They were drawn by the presence of Steel Mill, Bruce Springsteen's first band, an ensemble that also included drummer Vinnie Mad Dog Lopez and organist Danny Federici. Then,
Where was this, Randy?
where was this?
Yeah.
This was on Highway 36, the north side,
Yeah. No, Middletown.
in the Navesink area near the Highlands border.
The Cleveland zone, did I?
It was between Atlantic Highlands and Highlands. So event sponsors declined to end the music at the appointed hour, which prompted co-owner Richard C. Claver to disconnect the amplifiers. After band members reconnected them, matters got out of control. Police intervention was required to end the event. News reports provide plenty of he said, she said commentary, so the historical overview may be disputed in places. Pushing, shoving, biting, and the throwing of objects ensued. Arrests were made. Accusations of excessive force by the police, several of whom were injured, received post-melee scrutiny when they presumed that officers showed restraint to avoid a riot by a loud, large, aroused crowd of some 3,000 to 4,000 fans, some of whom were upset over the use of force. The 1960s culture wars were at a peak, with authorities dismayed at best or shocked at worst by the use of marijuana, the imbibing of alcohol, and the carrying on of sexual activity. Can you imagine that? Little came out of the arrests that night. The concerts came to an end, as eventually did the club in 1984. The place was razed in 1989. The site was vacant for many years, and there are a few ball fields there now.
Bruce always does do a long show.
This is the Howard Smith Fish Factory. What is a fish factory? Well, we shall learn. It is essentially an industry that extracted fish oil from oily menhaden fish. They had quite some uses in those days. It was a business where it was easy to get started. You just needed a small amount of equipment. The fishermen caught the fish. You boiled them, extracted the oil, sold the remains for fertilizer. But there was a problem with it. It stank, and it was an environmental mess. So it was simple for a small operative to start up in the 19th century. To define this fated business, fish processing was the extraction of oil from the menhaden, an inedible fish that traversed the Atlantic coast in enormous schools. To start a business, one merely needed a press, tanks, and heating equipment, along with means to package and or ship the extracted oil and the fish remains, which were used as fertilizer, and there were many uses for the oil. Fish oil became a raw material in myriad products, including pharmaceuticals, paints, lubricants, soaps, rosins, ink, and linoleum. The Canadian and European market even used it as cooking oil. By 1871, 3 local firms had canned the fish that was bony as well as oily, marketing it as food for humans and aiming to sell to European buyers. Some called the product shadines, although the menhaden resembled neither a shad nor a sardine. Eventually it was closed because there were better products that replaced what fish oil and fish scrap, as the remains were called. And a few years ago, some expensive housing was built on the site. It was vacant long enough. I presume the stink was gone, but I imagine that most of the residents there have no idea what their
I have one
site was used
question.
for.
That's great. In the lower right side, is that a mansion with a pool in front of it, or is it just?
The lower right side, that looks like a business building.
Okay. And not a pool. They just happened to grow next to all the.
No, the owner is not going to live anywhere near the plant. He was a real estate investor and owns some pretty fancy property. Edwin Clark Hazard is a legend in Shrewsbury. He built a ketchup factory, born in 1831 in Rhode Island to a distinguished family, the Hazards. But he came to New York to make his career, and he was prominent in the grocery business before he bought this place in Shrewsbury. Now, how did he become a legend, and what was so interesting about tomato ketchup at the time? We regard it today as perhaps one of the most prosaic of table condiments. But the early American tomato ketchup product was both dismal and often inedible, a sad state that stemmed from producers' scant interest in quality, along with the difficulty of preserving both harvested processed tomatoes and the finished ketchup. Dishonest processors even cooked rotten tomatoes or disguised foul product by adulteration with sugar or preservatives, practices that made much ketchup unpalatable at best and dangerous at worst. By the 1850s, ketchup lacked consumer acceptance. But Hazard set out to change that. He attained product differentiation by use of a costly, distinctive shaped bottle imported from Dresden, Germany, a bottle that became, as the language said at the time, so familiar to everybody, or at least that's what Hazard said. He advertised extensively. Hazard designed high-quality machinery that included silver-lined kettles that were utilized to preclude chemical reactions from tomato acids. The firm prospered, an inference from Hazard having built a substantial addition in order to double capacity. Two key Hazard innovations were tomato chutney made directly from the fruit and canned stewed tomatoes manufactured through heating rather than cooking. Hazard also produced oyster corn made from the pulp of sweet corn, canned asparagus, and Shrewsbury mayonnaise. Now, it would seem this was located on Sycamore Avenue, a very high-quality residential area, and it seems inexplicable today that you could have a factory in a residential area. But there were no restrictions then. Some like to rail against regulation of business. Well, you know, some regulation of business is pretty important, like not having a factory next to your house, which you might wind up with in Texas, for example. Eventually, the business faded after Hazard died. His family history after his death is quite interesting. It includes his son, Elmer Hazard, who is notable in Long Branch for the Hazard Hospital, which is also featured in the book. And Elmer is interesting for an inexplicable family history story. His mother is unknown. Now, in this questionable parentage, it's usually the father that's unknown. But in this case, it's the mother. It came around the time of a Hazard divorce. And even the family historian doesn't know. But families tend to distort history, and that has been an impediment with the Hazards, because when I first got involved in Shrewsbury history, there was still some second or third generation Hazards around, and they did so much to justify the perhaps unjustifiable. Lovett Nursery. I passed Lovett Nursery on my way in through Little Silver. Can't find anything there now except for one building, but at one point, Lovett had an enormous operation that, for practical purposes, put Shrewsbury on the, Little Silver on the map. He began with a Rumson nursery, and then, that's nothing.
Okay.
Thank you. And started out slowly, but he soon prospered and was able to assemble 100 acres in Little Silver, Lovett followed a formula for rapid growth by extensive advertising, quality plants, and the development of new varieties, such as the Hansel raspberry. He initially lived at the edge of the nursery in an extant building at 80 Church Street, about the only reminder of Lovett in town now. He remodeled this residence for business use after he moved his domicile. His rigorous and effective managerial practices assured efficiency and brought profitability, but fiscal concerns continued to challenge him. In 1885, the firm became insolvent but recovered. Seed propagation was developed into a major business and aided diversification. The firm also developed new fruit varieties, including several new straw varieties. Impressive now in an era when many regard the strawberry as a single fruit. Lovett claimed to have developed a hybrid strawberry raspberry and innovated the Loganberry, a hybrid of blackberry and raspberry. In addition, he produced rare dahlias. In 1912, their exhibition of the Catawba Comfort Grapes won the highest award ever given, a new variety, at the American Institute at New York, and here's a picture of it. It was celebrated as the finest grape ever introduced there. Now, Lovett had engaged in extensive real estate operations, and he bought more and more property to expand his grounds. He was literally all over the place in the surrounding area. But you won't find very many nurseries now. Why? For reasons similar to the end of these highway amusement places. The land becomes too valuable for that. So the fields were typically sold to be put to their highest and best use, likely for housing. Now, following the sale of their Little Silver property, Lovett relocated its headquarters to the Fowling section of Colts Neck, near a number of their fields. They maintained several farms into the 50s, but after Lester's death, Lester was a son in 1960, several factors led to the eventual sell-off and dissolution of the firm. Among the scant reminders is Lovett Road off Phalanx, which, if you pass by on your way out west, that was this family. Here's a small business that reminds us of changing lifestyles. This is in Middletown, literally within walking distance of my house. It's a Nut Swamp Distillery. It had some prior owners, but its best known was David Walling, who bought it in 1893. Only 1 1/4 acres. And what makes something like this interesting is the realization that in the early days, people didn't eat apples, they drank apples. There wasn't much of a market, it was too heavy to transport. The water may not have been the best. Well, of course, everyone had well water then, and maybe it's better than what we have now. But there was an enormous market for apple cider, fermented apple cider, some of which was distilled into apple jack. This business rose and fell with the times and regulations. World War I restrictions put a crimp into it. It recovered a bit, but then Prohibition made matters impossible. You, couldn't sell alcoholic beverages. And eventually, the Laird firm consolidated the business. I almost put Laird in the book. Now, they're one of the largest businesses in Monmouth County, but they just don't produce Applejack here any longer. They do that primarily in Virginia.
Randy, we have 25 minutes, 20 minutes.
25
maybe,
minutes?
Just
What time would you like me to end?
maybe about 20 after.
Okay, I may not, if I omit a few at the end, it is no great loss. Now, here we have a picture of the Red Bank Airport, but I call the entry Airfields because initially they weren't airports. An airfield, an aviator used any level ground where he could land and take off. typically on a farm field where he secured permission. And early flying was what you might call a fly-by-night operation. Well, not really. Night flying didn't come into effect until 10 or more years later. So some of these early airfields were so obscure that their location today isn't even known. However, in Monmouth County, we had a very important aviation pioneer, Robert Collier, who built a landing field on his estate in Marlborough, was one of the major figures in his time in aviation, and there's still a major prize given in his name. We had an early event, the air meet at Interlaken in 1910. Some of the country's most famed aviators visited there. But finally, after World War I, a veteran, Jack Casey, and his brother, acquired land and gradually developed and expanded what became the first legitimate airport in Monmouth County. It was somewhat of a safety hazard. They tried. They had a secondary commuter line established there, but a number of accidents, fatalities led to its end. There's quite a depiction of several places in the book, including the Marlborough field, but I want to go over that
Where was
quickly.
this one?
This one, well, it was actually in Chittenden Falls, on the Shrewsbury border, but as is so often the case, the places are known for the best-known nearby town. So it was on Shrewsbury Avenue on one side and Hance Avenue on the...
By Purr and Pooch.
By...
And McDonald's, kind of by
By the
McDonald's and Purr,
McDonald's,
yeah.
right. And I think there's an
I remember
airport in there, or something in the airport in its name, and there's a housing colony on much of the land. Oops, did I skip one? Oh. Here's a changing lifestyle. Rich men from the city could establish a social club on our nearby waters. The Neptune Club was established by men from Hudson County. They were on the Navesink River in Middletown Township on land owned by the Hartshorns. One thing I admire by them, they had strict attendance rules. It was not known as a yacht club, but they had early maritime activities, and one could say that they were the first yacht club in the area. It almost met a predictable end. Activity had waned by the 1890s. And then finally it succumbed to fire on February 17th, 1910. Interesting thing about this, in my experience, many use Sanborn fire insurance maps, which are online now, as a guide to the landscape and the buildings that were on it. And I saw an original of a Sanborn that pictured the Neptune Club, and written in pencil was one word: uninsurable. Someone was prophetic. Here's another sad story. The largest house in Red Bank ever built. Andrew Friedman, a New York businessman and Politico, who made a fair amount of money, mainly in transportation ventures, was a friend of boss Croca, and he had a house on the Kinney property that he purchased, which he raised in 1914 to undertake the construction of Red Bank's largest and costliest house, a 107 by 108-foot mansion designed by New York architect Herbert J. Krapp. Depiction of the number of rooms initially described as 50 varied over times. Friedman, who was born in New York in 1860, accumulated a fortune, much of it through New York City subway work. He owned the New York Giants baseball club, which, although a minor aspect of his business career, proved to have been a tempestuous one. In brief, he was reviled by many owners and players. The unmarried Friedman died in 1915 before the house was completed. Much of his fortune was left for charitable purposes, including an extant building in New York. Friedman provided for the Andrew Friedman home, erected on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, a huge facility that offered retirement quarters for the formerly well-off who had fallen on hard times. The building is now a New York City landmark and is still in charitable purposes. So the place was bought by Uzal McCarter, who had a pretty nice house in Rumson. He was one of the three McCarter brothers who were perhaps the most powerful family in New Jersey. The best-known McCarter property was in Rumson Hill, or was named Rumson Hill in Rumson. Actually, it spanned Rumson and Fairhaven and is depicted in the book.
So where was that house?
That house was on Hilltop Terrace.
Oh, across from Tower Hill.
It's
Yeah.
on a high hill. There is a water tank on the property now. The tank is buried, but you can see the cover, and the stairs to the original house can still be spotted. There's a fence around the tank. Unless you knew what you were looking for, you would never find it. You don't go on Hilltop Terrace passing through anything, but you can pass right by it on
Harding?
Ridge Road.
Ridge Road.
Ross Fenton Farm, I won't say too much about this. One could say a lot. Indeed, the Township of Ocean Historical Museum mounted an entire exhibition on it. It was established by Richard Russell Ulick, simply called the Farm in 1880s, recreational place. He hosted boxers who would train there. It was purchased by Charles Ross and Mabel Fenton as a summer place. They were vaudeville performers, and vaudevillians needed a place of summer relaxation because it was a tough grind traveling from place to place. Perhaps it attained its greater prominence after their time when it became a nightclub. It faded during the Prohibition period, eventually recovered. The later owners thought it might attain prominence if horse racing could get approved, but eventually it fell for housing, having been cleared by the typical Monmouth County property clearing process of fire.
Where was it?
It was on Beale Lake in Ocean Township. This could have been in the nostalgia section as well. I saw recently that there was a television show called Diners, Drive-In, and Dives. And the name astonished me at first because the drive-in is the antithesis of the diner, but still it's a nice alliterative show name. And it has a quite distinctive origin. The drive-in originated in the West, where the diner, the other roadside legendary culinary landmark, was regarded as an invasive species from the Northeast. The Pig Stand, that's an appealing name, isn't it? Opened on the Dallas-Fort Worth Highway in 1921 by J.G. Kirby, a candy and tobacco wholesaler, became the first drive-in. The Pig Stand distinguished itself from prosaic refreshment stands by curb service for the motorists. The proliferation of drive-ins was aided by the post-World War II boom in consumer spending, prolific sale of newly available automobiles, and the movement to suburbia. The drive-in represented not only a low-cost option for the growing trend of families eating out, but it also obviated the need for diners to dress up. The truly lazy did not even need to leave their cars. So Richard and Barbara Friedel opened this one in 1954. It was rather long-lasting because it had an ambiance that appealed to people. It had a great highway location on the route to the shore. And, of course, the sign. Drive-in restaurants, which waxed and waned over the third quarter of the 20th century, faced insuperable competition by the late 1970s from fast food chains, especially national chains that developed a consumer base through proliferation and extensive advertising. Perhaps rising land values on intensively developed highways made the demise of the Circus Drive-In inevitable. The Friedels sold the place in 2004. A later owner raised the Circus Drive-In on May 9th, 2018. The sign remained as a forlorn reminder until it was removed in August of 2021 and placed in storage with hope that it would rise again.
It's at InfoH, isn't it?
Must have been.
Is it, that's where they stored it? Yeah, they stored it in InfoH.
And Tilly.
Segregated schools. Now, here is an unpleasant aspect of our past. Each one seemed to have its own story and style, but they all had one common purpose, separating the races. This one is the Bang Street School in Asbury Park, which is a rather distinctive architectural feature, and shows the efforts that they would go through to keep the student bodies apart. The distinguished city architect, Ernest A. Aaron, created an innovative design for the Bang Street School in Asbury Park, completed in 1913. The school educated its two student bodies in a double school building that was depicted in the February 1914 School Board Journal. The article stated, "The building is in fact two independent and complete schools connected by an assembly hall accessible to both. The larger section faced an important thoroughfare of the city, Bangs Avenue, is occupied by white children, and the smaller section, with its main entrance on Madison Avenue, accompanied the colored pupils. An auditorium located between the two brought the respective student bodies together on necessity."
Couple more, one or two more.
Excuse me?
One or two more, Randy?
Yeah, we'll end
Yeah,
with,
okay.
with this one. I wanted
Oh.
to get this one in. This is not an effective illustration coming from the magazine. It works on the screen. Yes?
Bangs Avenue School.
Bangs Avenue.
Yes. Well, Bang, yeah, it's not street, it's
It's
Bang
not
Avenue.
Back Street, it's Bangs Avenue.
Oh, I made a, oh, you know, I
Yes,
didn't
Bangs
think
Avenue.
that this was
My,
going to get
my
through.
first school that I ever attended, Bangs Avenue.
Thank
Bang
you.
Avenue,
Yeah, I knew I would get one of these titles wrong. The illustration in the book is the Court Street School in Freehold,
In Freehold.
which has an ancient history going back to, at least the 1870s, or at least the predecessor school. The existing school was built in 1912. It was expanded later, and it has a really fine history of educating generations of African American students. Some of them rose to distinguished careers, receiving their elementary education there. The interesting aspect of the Court Street School comes after World War II, when the 1947 Constitution banned school segregation. So what did they do in Freehold? They closed the school rather than integrate it. And they kept it closed until they were so desperate for space, several years later, they had to open it. And then some white parents would refuse to send their kids to this school, although if they just had regional district lines, the problems would have been solved. That's how strong the issue was in Freehold. Eventually, it became a community center. It's standing now.
What happened to this building?
This is still an instructional use. And the interesting thing about the Bangs Avenue School is that it was built as two schools in one, a segregated school, but now the nature of the student body makes it all, practically all minority, maybe 100%. And I understand that its future as an instructional site is precarious.
So they go back and forth, about every 2 years they change their mind. So it was the Barack Obama school,
Yeah.
but now it's back to the Baton Avenue school.
They changed the name again? Is it still the Barack Obama School?
I think it's back to Bangs now.
Well, when I finished the book, it was still Barack
It was
Obama.
the Barack.
Now we have some of the preserved places, and we'll skip over these. I don't know, do we have any time for questions?
Oh, yeah, time for a few
And I
questions.
certainly hope we have some time to offer you the
Oh, yes.
book.
That's why I want to leave a little time for all of that.
The book is $22 plus $1 sales tax. I have a couple of my other titles with me, including one of the Images of America Long Branch books. But can I take a couple questions here?
Sure.
If there are any.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Well, I just make a comment, if you're young enough, if you're old enough, if you lived around here, you remember the one thing that got the New York radio stations talking about Monmouth County.
New York, what, look?
Radio stations talking about Monmouth County, the only thing I remember,
And what was that?
when the Hollywood Hotel burned down, and we were there at the hotel, it got on New York radio, and that was the first time anybody had ever mentioned, Long Branch or Monmouth County or anything.
Well, there was another hotel fire that got into the New York Times, and that was
Is that after the Hollywood Hotel?
the Scarborough Hotel.
That was
And-
earlier.
And I mentioned the Scarborough because it was owned by Norman Mailer's family. And I gave a little presentation at the Norman Mailer conference a few years ago, and it was held at Monmouth. And I revealed that it was arson by the owners, and the family didn't want to believe it. But in this instance, the evidence was down cold, but still, the insurance company gave some kind of a settlement in fear of a lawsuit because despite the evidence, juries can be rather generous when the defendant is an insurance company. Well, I'll be at the table if anyone has any other question. Other Long Branch sites include a rundown of the hotels and perhaps one or two others.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Randy, for presenting, and please stay if you have some questions or if you want to take some refreshments on the way out for the road. That's perfectly fine. Thank you for coming tonight.